Hi,
right.
everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Major Garrett from CBS News and Phil Briggs from Connecting Vets with us. They're here to talk about the future of journalism and news in general. All right, you guys can go ahead.
All right, I'll kick it off. And what little I can add to that conversation, it's a pretty lofty goal, the future of news, Major. So I hope you don't mind we teed you up to take on
Yeah.
such a mountain of a topic.
How
But,
much time do we have?
Yeah, right. I was going to say we're limited to about 45 minutes to an hour
Okay.
here, but let me do a little read in for you, just to,
Sure.
if you're joining us and unsure about who the hell anybody is or why you want to be here. Major Garrett is an American journalist who's chief Washington correspondent for CBS News. He's the host of the Takeout podcast. Was a correspondent for National Journal. Kind of worked on both sides of the fence in journalism too, as a former correspondent with Fox News as well. And 2004 covered the presidential election. In fact, probably covered everyone since. The GWAT era, of course, for us veterans concerned. He's covered the global war on terror for years and various presidential elections since. And occasionally has to fill the shoes of Nora O'Donnell as the anchor and the host of CBS Evening News, seen nationwide. And I can only imagine what those shoes feel like, Major. I didn't know they made them in your size. Nice.
Yes. Well, my friends often remind me, hey, that's Walter Cronkite's chair. And I say, don't remind me. So it's more the chair than the shoes, but it's all the same thing. It's an important endeavor to host an evening news broadcast. And whenever I'm allowed to do it, I'm privileged to do so.
Outstanding. All right. I'm a syndicated radio host. I do for CBS and for connectingvets.com as well. A weekly show called CBS Eye on Veterans. It's a podcast, and each week we highlight and focus veteran issues and some really cool veteran guests. Everything from like Osama bin Laden's shooter, Rob O'Neill, famous SEAL Team 6 veteran, was just on with me recently. But, I cover veterans if they start a new beer brand or a barbecue sauce, hiring initiatives, franchises, small business development, and then, of course, tracking legislation and the political officials who, often stand up there and claim to care and then conveniently forget who we are a week later. We kind of hold them to the fire there. And I'm tracking right now burn pit legislation, among other things, as it goes through some of its final variations, and encourage you all to check out CBS Eye on Veterans everywhere you get podcasts. Now, with all that as the intro, let's jump in. Just kind of a casual conversation here. Major, I've always wanted to get to know you a little bit better. And let's kind of start way back. We all see network news and the evening news and Washington correspondent and news bureaus and stuff. But behind all that is a humble background. And we all start kind of the same way, young, hungry journalist wanting to get in the game, and we're a noob, don't even know what we don't know. Share with me where you come from.
Grew up in San Diego, California. And so let's clear one thing up. Major is my name. It's not a rank. Never has been, never will be. So I'm a major in name only. And props to all authentic majors. You have my respect. So how did that happen? Well, it was my father's name and my grandfather's name. We all have different middle names, so I'm not Major Garrett II or Junior, thank goodness. And just for the record, my one and only son, his name is Luke. So we said 3 generations of Major is enough. And he has an older brother and an older sister. And perhaps around me, you can see some of the arrayed accumulated gifts from my children over the years. They're 28, 26, and 22, respectively. Godfather, not my all-time favorite movie, but certainly an important movie. And I grew up in San Diego. My parents both worked for AT&T, so they were executives. So I had a working mother as an executive who carried a briefcase in the 60s and 70s, highly unusual for the time, but one of the greatest advantages of my professional career, because since my mother carried a briefcase to work and was an engineer and an executive, meeting powerful, influential women in my life was never odd to me. It was just the way the world was supposed to be. So I was ahead of a lot of my male counterparts, fortunately so. And because my parents had what I think is fairly described as upper middle class sensibilities, they wanted us to be well-informed children of theirs. I had an older brother and older sister. And so they subscribed to the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune and Time and Newsweek and US News and World Report. I think we were kind of unusual that way, to have all 3 weekly magazines subscribed to. And just for reference, I was born in August of 1962. I had two cousins who were in the United States Army in Vietnam. Both came home whole, I'm happy to say. One of them, my eldest cousin, Craig, served 2 tours of duty, which means he went back voluntarily a second time. And then after his service, decided to stay in the Army because he was part of that rank of junior corps officers post-Vietnam who looked around the United States Army and said, if someone doesn't stick around, this is going to fall apart. And it's that rung of officers just below Colin Powell and that generation that stayed and helped, as he told it to me, and I think history has pretty accurately reflected this, stitch things back together in the post-Vietnam era. And he is the closest thing I know to an authentic hero. He's buried at Arlington. And I always looked up to him for that and so many other reasons. But while he was in Vietnam and my other cousin, his brother Ricky were, I remember packing care packages for them as a child, which meant I watched the news very closely. I read the news avidly. And I really couldn't think of anything else I wanted to do in life other than be a shortstop on a Major League Baseball team or an actor. Well, those things all sort of fell apart by the time I was 13 or 14. So there was really only one thing left, be a reporter. And my great goal and ambition was to see if I could ever make it to Washington, our nation's capital, cover politics and see if I could hang with it. And I arrived here in 1990 and have been here ever since. But before that, to your point, my first job after graduating from the University of Missouri, the world's first and best school of journalism, I was a cop reporter in Amarillo, Texas for 2 years. Then I was a cop reporter in Las Vegas, Nevada for 2 years. Then I was a general assignment reporter for 2 years in Houston, Texas. Sort of working my way through what I regard as single A, double A, and triple A ball before I got to DC. And I spent 18 years in print before television ever came in my direction. I'm quite candidly an accidental television correspondent. I was working at US News and World Report when I got a call from Frank Sesno, then the bureau chief of CNN, who asked me if I wanted to cover the White House on a television network. And I said, why not? And that first year was pretty rough. If I had to watch any of those early live shots for CNN, I think I would go before the United Nations asserting a human rights violation of one form or another. But we worked it out. Reps matter in all things in life, whether it's a golf swing, a speech, or, as it turns out, doing live television. So that worked out. Was at CNN for 2.5 years. I was with President Bush on 9/11. We can talk about that. Then CNN, because television is, if nothing, a volatile industry. I decided after 2.5 years it had seen enough of me on camera and fired me. And there's a phrase in our industry that you're never truly a broadcaster until you've been fired. Not for cause, just because they wanted to move on. So I went to Fox, was there for 8 years. Then I left television, went to National Journal for 2 years. And then CBS offered me the job of chief White House correspondent, a job if you turn down, you've turned down for the remainder of your career. So I didn't turn it down. And a couple, 3 years ago, I was made chief Washington correspondent. And that in a nutshell is how we got to here.
Very cool. One thing we'll circle back to is about coming up through double A and then single A and then the majors, that kind of strata. I want to come back to in a bit and find out more about that relevance in today's media landscape, because it seems to have changed. But before we do that, you mentioned something and kind of skipped over a great question that I want to dive deeper in, but career milestones. And you'd mentioned that one that I always knew about, but being with President Bush on 9/11. Elaborate a little bit on that, just what that day was like and kind of, you know, how it started. We all know how it ended.
Yeah, it started as among the most ordinary days that you could think of when you cover a president. There is no ordinary day when you cover an American president. You know, anything can happen, but I didn't know that could happen. I had no inkling of that. I remember that morning we woke up in Sarasota, Florida. It was day 2 of a 2-day trip to Arizona, not to Arizona, to Florida to talk about education. And the president had very little on his public schedule. He had a series of remarks at an elementary school that morning, going to get back on Air Force One, fly back to Washington in an afternoon of meetings. And it looked like as manageable and ordinary a day as you could conceive of covering an American president, always understanding that, again, anything can happen. You have to be prepared for anything. But that morning, President Bush went for a jog. So did I, separately. And there's video. You can see it on any of the documentaries of him jogging back. He actually jogged that day with Dick Kyle, a reporter with Bloomberg, who had a nickname Stretch because he was very tall. Bush talks to the reporters about education and tax policy very casually. He doesn't look like he has a care in the world. Goes back, showers, and by the time he's in the motorcade heading to the elementary school, there is word that something has happened at one of the towers in Midtown Manhattan, Lower Manhattan rather. And we at the time were in the elementary school, pre-positioned in an adjacent classroom. What happens when the traveling White House press corps travels with the president, wherever he is, there's a place set up nearby, very nearby, often in the same building, where television sets are, and there's a pool to transmit all the audio and video. Back then, this is 2001, very little cell technology. Everything is hard line. Everyone has 2 or 3 phones on their tables, and we're watching things play out in New York. And we see the thing happen. The aftermath of the first jet. We don't even know it's a jet yet. The country had no clue that it was a jet. Bush is on his way. In the motorcade, there is some inkling that his staff has, but the pool of reporters doesn't. That something is very odd, but they don't know how odd, and they certainly don't know how dangerous playing out in the Twin Towers. And I'll never forget, and we will all say this about 9/11, but I will never forget many things that day. But among the things I will most remember is being in that room, about 20 other White House reporters and producers watching live television coverage and seeing the second jet fly into the second tower. And none of us could believe what we saw. We saw it. They're trained observers, professionally trained observers. And we all looked at each other in complete disbelief and couldn't stop saying, "Did you just see that? What was that? What did we just see?" Because we couldn't imagine that what happened, that what our eyes told us happened, had actually happened. And the next most important thing I remember from that morning, while the president was in Sarasota, was that neither he nor those closest to him had a real sense of what was going on. And if you'll follow this metaphor with me, it's been my experience covering many presidents, back to George Herbert Walker Bush all the way to present day, that every morning and every day and every night, the American president sits atop a pyramid of information, very top. And that information is fed up to the president through all sorts of agencies, DOD, DIA, CIA, state, NSA, Homeland Security, though we didn't have a Homeland Security, that everyone funnels this information, and atop this pyramid, the president sits. Well, on that day and in that morning particularly, that pyramid began to flatten. And for 2, 3, maybe upwards of 6 very unsettled hours, that morning of September 11th, 2001, what the president knew and what the rest of the country knew was not very far apart, certainly not the pyramid that it typically is. And that is evidenced by what we were told when the president left Sarasota, Florida. We were told he was going back to Washington. He wasn't in the air for more than 30 minutes before they diverted to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And we weren't given any idea what would happen after Barksdale. They were making it up as they were going along for obvious reasons. Then he went to Offutt Air Force Base for Strategic Air Command consultations before returning to Washington. And so all those things played out. And by the time the president took off from Sarasota, my role in the story completely vanished. And we were marooned, all the reporters, in Sarasota for the next 2.5 days. Because remember, all the airplanes were grounded. We flew down there on a charter. The airline that had the charter wasn't going to put it in the air, even when given special FAA clearance. They weren't going to put it in the air to take reporters back to Washington. So we were stuck. And we were there for 2.5 days until we finally decided that the only way to get back to Washington was to charter 3 buses and have them drive us 23.5 hours back to Andrews. So that was 9/11.
Wow, chills. And thank you for sharing that. I know that there's certain stories that all of us will cover in our life that we'll never forget. And I know that that day not only is a story you won't forget, but it's a day that changed even many of the attendees' lives here today. Because
And
a
one
lot
of the
us
things I will point out
answered the call to that.
is on that day, as it unfolded, I remember being prepared to go on air for CNN. And in my IFB, the earpiece I had, I could hear all the chatter both in Atlanta and New York. And there were reports at the time, the Pentagon had just been struck. We hadn't gotten the information yet about Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but there were reports that the State Department had blown up. There were reports that there was a massive explosion on the National Mall. Neither of those things turned out to be true, but in that morning, everything seemed possible, and every report of an explosion or some catastrophe at some other part of the city of Washington seemed possible. And sorting all that out on the fly was exceedingly difficult, because what did happen and what was confirmable was of such enormous gravity that itself was unimaginable. And then everything else, rumor mill and people hearing things or suspecting something that it wasn't true. Basically, that morning, anything horrible seemed possible.
Mm. Yeah. And again, you know, the front door and the opening to the GWAT generation, which so many then would be motivated by, inspired by, and would stand up and answer that call. And
several of my friends. Yeah.
Crazy to think how much ground has been covered in the last 2 decades, and, you know, lives lost, but not just that, but just the geopolitical landscape, the change in the world that became from that day, or that came from that day. Just mind blowing. Well, that's not where we want to leave it, though. Not necessarily just a look at history here, but thank you for sharing that. It kind of segues into what we want to talk about today, and that's sort of like the future. We've seen the past. We've seen, just in what you were talking about, how technology was even different back then. You know, people with flip phones and 2 and 3 different phones, and you know, all hardwired, and now it's wireless technology and Bluetooth, and we're all online with smartphones, and information seems to transmit instantly. And oftentimes rumor can be, you know, you can't tell rumor from news, and you can't tell news from fact, and you can't tell fact from fiction. It's just so blurry and messy with the speed of things. Share with me a little bit about your thoughts on, you know, how we do the business of reporting today. Have we gotten better with evolution? Is the technology making us smarter, better reporters, or is it simply opening the door to these gray areas, which oftentimes confuse us more than inform us?
Technology is advantageous in some forms of reporting. It's much easier to go through vast troves of information and do keyword searches, and you can do historical contextualized reporting much more rapidly with the internet than you could going to a library or having a large library in your own newsroom. I remember when I was at the Houston Post, which is where I worked in Houston, it was then the 14th largest newspaper in the country. 1/3 of its entire structure on the 7th or 8th floor was devoted to a newspaper library with books and clippings and microfilm. And that's how you verified things. You actually went there manually and verified facts that were providing historical context for your stories. All that can now be done digitally and much more rapidly. So that is an enhancement. But in many other respects, because things are so rapid and so many things can look like journalism that aren't, and I'm not just talking about deep fakes, I'm just talking about things that masquerade as journalism, that just sort of repopulate things and put something on it that makes it look journalistic. There's a lot more confusion. And certainly our industry has lent to that confusion by placing editorial content, meaning opinionated content, so closely or sometimes interweaving it with news content. And that also blurs lines and confuses consumers of news. The one thing I would say is technology has always shifted what is written or what is heard and what is seen in a news context. Before it was seen, it was only heard. Before it was heard, it was only read. And of course, originally it wasn't read, it was spoken, folk tales and other things. But every evolution in technology has brought its own challenges, but the fundamentals of accuracy, verifiable facts, and staying with a story to provide its largest possible context has always been the challenge. Technology speeds things up, but it doesn't change the rigorous nature of the journalism that is behind it. Though it looks that way, and it's hard to be as rigorous when you are facing 16 deadlines in a given day as opposed to 1 or 2. Just as an example, when I entered this business in the summer of 1984 in Amarillo, Texas, I had 2 deadlines. 2. Now, if you work as a digital journalist for a newspaper, you might have 16 in a day, where you're just constantly churning and trying to update your stories. Gives less time for reporting and context because you're having to relentlessly update. That takes your time away from the journalism and puts it more on the production side. The same pressures apply for local TV journalists. And that's a harder challenge to meet. But the voraciousness, people always want their phones to be updated. And if their phones aren't being updated, they'll take their eyes and therefore their clicks somewhere else. And so news organizations feel this overwhelming pressure to constantly update as opposed to journalistically differentiate. It's a very tough commercial challenge to meet. And if you're a very large news organization with a lot of cash behind it, like the Washington Post with the infusion of Jeff Bezos, you have more room to experiment, you have more room to fail, and you have more room to commercially weather some of those storms. But other journalistic organizations don't and haven't, and have withered as a result. So journalism doesn't change. Technology changes it, but it does apply new pressures and new commercial pressures that are very hard to adjust to. And they're a relentless challenge across the industry.
I'm glad you spelled that out in some detail, because it kind of foreshadows what we'll talk about here at the end. And that's a little bit about where to find jobs and what skill sets we need, what's going to be required of us in this digital content world we live in. And man, it's exhausting. Before we go there, I wanted to chat a little bit about, well, you nailed 2 of them kind of already. I want to get deeper onto, well, we'll do a quick one. The alphabet letter networks that we all see.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to say that it's kind of BS how they've all just sort of chosen a lane? Like, you can tell what the spin on CNN is going to be in the morning, and then you flip over and it doesn't take long to know what Fox is going to be on. And you could literally take the same event and you can just almost predict how they're going to slice the pie. And has that done us a disservice? Is it fair to say that that's BS, that they just report in their lanes now, and that you almost have to like read between the network lines to figure out what the hell the real story is?
I would say it's not 100% true, but it's more true than not. And of course, I would just step back for a second and say, you know, that's what the Brits and the Europeans used to say about all American journalism, that it was lazy, it was full of homerism, it was full of jingoism, and it wasn't nearly as skeptical as American journalists thought it was. And I've heard and encountered and read that criticism of American journalism, and that goes back to Vietnam, it goes back to the Iraq War, goes back to Afghanistan, that we're just not critical enough, we don't dig hard enough, and we are too willing to take the official line, particularly if it's of a national glorification or pseudo-jingoistic. These are all European terms. So American journalists get a lot of grief a lot for a lot of justifiable reasons. But this is a more pronounced and, like you said, commercially defined space. And I regret that it's more true than not. And look, I worked at a network that got that ball rolling. I mean, Fox is the first network to say in a 24-hour news format that news stopped at 7 p.m. That's when the editorial columns took over. And then MSNBC decided, well, that's a business model for us as well. And both networks operate in that way, and they told themselves and told their audiences that that would never bleed into anything. Well, of course it bleeds in. If your bell cow ratings grabber shows are editorial left or right, and your audience therefore is gravitating and your business model is increasingly defined or supported by this editorial content in the primetime hours, you're kidding yourself if you don't believe over time there's going to be some seepage into the rest of the day. And that sort of is what you're talking about. And I think one of the more harmful aspects of that, and I talk to lawmakers on Capitol Hill about this all the time, and they don't disagree with me, they just would rather not change. I say, why do you just go on one network? Isn't that easy? Isn't that boring after a while? Why do you go where every game's a home game? Don't you ever want to be pushed back and like go into the metaphorical lion's den of Fox or MSNBC, where there was a tendency 5 or 10 years ago to maybe do that more commonly, and the bookers gravitated in that direction. Now it's more regimented, either by edict or ease. It's just easier that way. There's less resistance, and you have to make fewer phone calls or send fewer texts or emails or whatever. But when every game's a home game, you lose the sense of your own ideas being challenged and an awareness of what the other side is thinking and why. And that's led to a very noticeable, not only partisanship, that's easy, of course it's partisan, but American politics have always been partisan. My deeper concern is about the calcification of it. That just ideas don't bump into each other the way they used to, or the way I believe the way they should, and I believe the way our country benefits the most from. Because when ideas are siloed and everyone is just basically applauding for the same set of ideas, guess what happens? Yeah, they sit in disbelief that there are even other ideas out there, whether they should take them seriously. And that's where we find ourselves now. So I think those aspects of journalism have other effects that are not just about news consumers and whether they're satisfied or not, but whether or not we're actually bumping into each other with relevant ideas that help get the country move forward.
Mm. Are we as news consumers then, and this is outside of us being journalists, but like as just viewers of the world and watching TV and listening to radio and reading websites, should we be taking like a sip from both drinks? You know,
Sure.
should I have one of these and one of these? Should I be watching simultaneously? I had a prop ready to.
Yes, exactly. Without applying any embrace of any specific brand, yes, I give speeches with some regularity, and I always get a variation of this question: Major, where should I go? What should I do? What should I read? And I don't have a holistic answer for that. I don't. What I do have an answer for is just this simple philosophical or semi-philosophical construct, which is this. As a news consumer, if from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep every night, the news you consume leaves you feeling generally satisfied, certainly reaffirmed, and in the main, comfortable, and even borderline happy, well, then you're doing it all wrong. And as long as consumers send signals that they're comfortable with being made comfortable and reassured and reaffirmed, guess what you're going to get? Exactly that. So you got to take your clicks, you got to take your eyeballs and cast them elsewhere. And also, just to do something to support the cause, you got to pay for it. You got to pay for it because journalism is expensive. Good journalism is expensive. Bad journalism is free. Good journalism is expensive. That's why The Economist costs what it does. That's why the Financial Times costs what it does. They put the price right up front. And it costs money to do this work and to do it well on a consistent basis. And I have this conversation with my 3 children all the time because they're of the generation where they more or less think it's a constitutional right to get journalism for free, because that's the way they were raised. There were no barriers to entry. Everyone, hey, just bounce around. You can get all the content everywhere you want. Yes, you can get content wherever you want and for nothing. But content and journalism are not synonymous and never will be, not in my dictionary.
Content and journalism, not synonymous. So interesting. I have an editor I wish you could share that with. And
Trust me, I've lost that battle more than I've won it, but I'm not giving up.
I'm going to have some quality content right now because it is officially 4:30. Speaking to that, just quickly, have we kind of evolved sort of, I don't know if we've evolved in the wrong direction is the right way to say it, but like, we're judged as journalists' success based on downloads, clicks, page views. I interviewed Senator Tester a few weeks ago and challenged him on honoring our PACT Act, which I think is the best damn bill out there to help find presumption for veterans dying from exposure to burn pits. And I interviewed a NASCAR driver with a mullet and great Southern accent. Mm-hmm. And the NASCAR driver got 10 times the downloads that Senator Tester's interview did.
Right.
By all quantification, that one interview was not successful and the other interview was successful. And then you compare me to Cameron Diaz's hairstyle tips, and she's probably got 10 times the downloads I do.
Yeah.
And are we doing a disservice by judging each other by downloads? Does the news media, will the networks ever say that's quality stuff, man? Keep making that. I don't care how many downloads it get. I'm going to put my shoulder behind it and promote the slow horse. Or are we constantly going to be looking at, well, you're only a successful piece of content if you get more clicks than the Kardashians?
So this is both a very new and very old question. Very old in the sense that, look, let's be honest. Newspapers, when I worked at newspapers, like I said, 3 different cities in America, they had a very large sales staff. There was local content that was meant to attract an audience. And there was within that newsroom and within the daily newspaper news product, an idea of dessert, spinach, broccoli, steak, potatoes, and try to create something along there. But, sports stories, scandal stories. I mean, you go back and you look at some of the most read newspaper stories in our country's history. They're almost all scandal stories, sensational crimes, sensational trials. Some of them covered accurately, some of them just covered hysterically for consumption. That's always been a problem, if you will, and a commercial reality. So these measuring sticks of circulation are people coming up and pulling the newspaper out of the paper boy's hands on the corner and dropping a nickel in his hand or his cup or on the shelf. That's the same thing. Clicks and workability and usability. And celebrification was always more sexy and commercially viable than government reports. That's always been true. And what you hope for, and this is where the economic pressures on our industry work in very difficult and stressful ways. The smaller your news organization gets and the tighter its profit margins, the more it has to rely on clickable content. What you need and what you want is news organizations large enough to do all of these things and try to build a kind of buffet where there is the things that are clickable, but also the things that are valuable, so the news consumer can take in all of them. But as local newspapers and community newspapers around our country have shriveled and died, that's all disappeared. And so local journalism of that nature doesn't exist nearly as vibrantly as it did 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So that's disappeared. So then you have more content merchants who are giving you these things that are clickable, but not necessarily valuable, and fewer institutions large enough to do a little bit of both, like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times. I mean, I was talking to a former member of the Florida legislature who's now works on Florida politics and national politics from a consultancy basis, but he was in the Florida legislature for a good long while. And he was talking to me just last week. He said, look, Major, all the reporters who used to make my life miserable when I was in Tallahassee in the Florida legislature 10 years ago no longer live in Florida. They all live in Washington because they had to come here to find a job. Because all their newspapers have either shuttered their capital bureaus or downsized them to such a degree they can't work anymore. And so when you have fewer and fewer large and robust news organizations, you have more and more peddlers and merchants of clickbait content and clickbait things that aren't journalistic and that don't have that rounded variety that every newspaper used to have and the networks used to have and the cables used to have. So it is a huge challenge. We've always had a preference for things that are a little bit lighter. But in my lifetime, in my career, certainly in Washington, the celebrity culture and the political culture have merged and gotten closer and closer and closer. The first presidential campaign I covered was 1992. And one of the contrasts was generational, but there was also this idea that Bill Clinton had sort of deeper relationships in the Hollywood world. Linda Bloodworth Thomas and Jeff, some of the record producers, David Geffen and others. And that's continued. And this idea that Hollywood and Washington kind of have this buddy-buddy relationship or estrangement that filters through our understanding of both celebrities and politics, where when I was a child, the idea that these worlds merged was only roughly. Yes, Frank Sinatra knew JFK and others, and Ronald Reagan had certainly his history in Hollywood. But the idea that we would talk about it and talk to each other and there would be this intersection on almost a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, much more true now than it was then. And that's blended these worlds and made one look a lot more like the other than it used to. And that feeds this idea that news consumption and celebrity consumption kind of, to get back to one of your earlier metaphors, get very blurry.
Mm. And I guess building on that, I'm wondering, for those of us that are looking to get into journalism at a larger level than where we are right now, maybe we want that next job, we want to climb that next rung on the ladder. And full disclosure, I'm one of those, painfully hoping that the podcast world grows and that CBS Eye on Veterans gets promoted, gets grown, gets to be on, advertisements and television and magazines and the cable networks. I want that from my superiors at CBS, and I'm not getting it. And in full disclosure, for me as a journalist that's got a couple decades under his belt, my recent pay growth this last year came from a side business I started that has nothing to do with journalism, because I figured I'm only going to make more money by trying to find my side hustle and do something. All that said, if I do want to penetrate that next level, if I do want to break through that ceiling, and I'm one of our listeners here that's got some chops, got some skills, knows they can contribute to this industry, am I best to pitch myself to the networks now as crazy viral content? Am I the guy that's going to recreate the Will Smith, Chris Rock slap on the Capitol Hill steps? Do I want to be the guy that covers, the marijuana initiative by puffing up on the back steps of the Senate? I mean, am I supposed to be crazy and get wacky to get noticed? Or am I supposed to follow the A-League, AAA league, minors, then majors? I mean, your career path, I don't think could be duplicated in 2022.
It couldn't. There's not a chance. There's zero chance of my career path being replicated now. Zero chance. Because there's not a newsroom large enough to teach me as much as that Amarillo newsroom did from 1984 to 1986, or the newsroom I worked in at the Las Vegas Review-Journal from 1986 to 1988, or the Houston Post from 1988 to 1990. I mean, at the Houston Post, I covered the Loma Prieta earthquake in San Francisco for 7 days as a national correspondent for a paper based in Houston. I covered the San Francisco earthquake because it was a national global story, and the Houston Post had national global ambitions. I covered plane crashes in Dallas and mass murder in Mexico when I was in Houston because it had big ambitions and a huge newsroom. That trajectory doesn't exist. Most reporters want to get straight to Washington if they can, or a big city, because that's the only place where the jobs exist. Now, podcasting and the like have lowered the barriers of entry, but they've also cluttered the visible marketplace, and it's very hard to stand out. And I'm the last voice you will ever hear that will say the way to succeed is to be wacky. I just don't live in that space. I mean, I'm a reporter who is very infrequently on Twitter. Watch my Twitter feed. It's incredibly boring. Incredibly boring.
I was going to say something, but I'm glad you did.
It's just because I offer no opinions, zero, except on one topic, the San Diego Padres. Okay. I've had an abusive relationship with the San Diego Padres since I was 7 years old, and they entered the National League in 1969. Other than that, no opinions, zero. You won't see I'm not on Instagram. I don't do TikTok. I'm not on Facebook. I don't do any of those things. I'm not supposed to be part of the story, period. That is a very old-fashioned idea. And the reason I cling to it is because I can. I'll be 60 in August. The end is near. Okay. I have adapted to podcasts. I've adapted to television. I've shifted my range of abilities within journalism, but I haven't shifted or altered or diluted my standards. But a lot of young journalists get very far doing things that are much, much edgier and much more opinionated than I would ever be comfortable with. And I wouldn't have even imagined as a young reporter. And I do think there are parts of our industry that have got to reckon with that, about this idea that reporters get visibility, therefore get a following and an identity and a branding because they do these things. And I don't blame reporters for trying to find commercial viability separate from their news organizations, because they've watched their news organizations, either the ones they work for or the ones they aspire to, shrink before their very eyes. So you mentioned a side hustle. They're like, no, this is my main hustle. And the only way to keep it vibrant and viable is to be edgier and more opinionated. That's a tension within our business, a very real tension. And happily, I work at a news organization that doesn't feel that tension as much. It's insulated from it because it's part of a large corporate structure. There are advantages to that for sure. And I'm grateful, deeply grateful that I work where I work, and I've been able to work here since 2012. And I don't envy young reporters or any reporter in that sort of 30-year-old, 40-year-old category navigating this world. What I do know is that I've been lucky enough to be a television correspondent, to do a tremendous amount of work on radio, to develop 2 podcasts. I'm in the process of developing a 3rd. I'm finishing my 5th book. So I've been able to exist and do all the things I ever wanted to do in this business because I've been adaptable and innovative, but I haven't been edgy and I haven't been opinionated. And that's where I'm going to stay. And the only advice I can give anyone who wants to enter this business or move higher in it is to learn more and write better.
Learn more, write better. Okay. Is there a key person, probably my last question here. Is there a key person in an organization that we should be looking for, a key position that we should be looking to get to know? Is it executive producer? Is it segment producer? Is it booking producer? Who's that person that we should really get to know if we want to penetrate that next level?
For a job?
Yeah, or for noticeability, for our brand to get noticed, for our reel to get looked
so
at.
if you want your brand to get noticed, you got to go through bookers for sure, and segment producers. Executive producers are usually too busy, and they're not job yes or no people. They're job yes or no people when it's moved far enough up the chain where you're in the top 1 or 2 or 3 anyway, but they're not going to be a part of the original sifting or the second layer of filtration. But getting to know as many people within any news organization of a large size, but definitely producers, associate producers, even broadcast associates. No one is too small because everyone rises up. One of my good friends is currently the chief of staff to Condoleezza Rice. When I first met her, she was a deputy press secretary in the lower press office in the latter years of the Bush presidency. Now she's the gatekeeper for Condi Rice. Okay, these things happen. So no one is too small. No bit of information is too insignificant if you are hungry for that next rung on the ladder.
Very cool. Very cool. I'll turn it back over to my friends at MVJ and the audience. If anybody has anything they want to ask, I don't know if that's what we're doing here or not,
Sure.
but I mean, I figure we got a couple minutes, before we reach, the hard stop at the hour. Anybody, anything?
Absolutely. If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, send it in the chat, or just unmute and go ahead. Karan, I see that you have your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Major Garrett and Philip.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. Major, I am honored to be in your presence because I've watched you for so many years, and your coverage has really been straightforward and effective.
Thank you.
My question to you is, what has been the single most important thing in your transition into being over the Washington coverage? What has been the most important thing to you as a journalist, and the most important thing to you personally making that transition?
To covering Washington politics as opposed
Yes.
to local news?
Yes.
Well, the biggest hurdle when you get to Washington, there are two enormous hurdles when you get to Washington as opposed to covering news in a local format, as I did in 3 different communities in our country. The two biggest hurdles are information and sources. And there's so much information in Washington. And when I first got here, I was covering Congress. I'd never covered a state legislature on a day-to-day basis. I'd never covered even a city council or a county government. And so much of the language of Congress was completely unfamiliar to me. It was like trying to learn Greek on the fly and write a daily story about this place and these strange habits and rules and Byzantine subcommittee and committee procedures in a different language. So the language barrier was just enormous, and you have to learn that rapidly, and you have to admit what you don't know, and you have to ask lots of stupid questions and listen to a lot of people harangue you for being so ignorant. But you just have to push through it because there's only one way to learn on the fly, and that's the way you learn. You basically throw yourself on the mercy of whomever is merciful, and even at the mercy of people who aren't, but who may yell at you and tell you something you remember that's helpful. The other thing is sources, and that's developing human relationships with people who know and building them up over time. And one of the things you learn is the longer you're here and the more people you get to know and the higher the food chain your credibility and your career trajectory allow you to enter, the fewer calls you have to make. That is to say, 6 calls to 6 deputies is not the same as 1 call to a chief of staff in the room. 6 calls to 6 deputies who are hearing it secondhand from their legislative assistant in a legislative or Hill context is not as good as the chief of staff who was sitting in on the meeting. Okay, and you try to build yourself up in that direction if you can. Same thing at the White House, same thing at any agency. So those are the 2 biggest hurdles: information and people in the room. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of shoe leather.
Thank you.
Okay. Would anybody else like any advice or have any questions? Russell, I see you have your hand raised.
Hello, Major. How are you today?
Good.
Thanks so much. I just want to echo what Karan said and say how thankful I am that you're sharing this time with military veterans to help us to think about our careers. And the question that I have for you is, what do you read? What are some of the? You mentioned a couple of publications earlier, but when you wake up in the morning or you're on the train or whatever it is you're doing, what are you reading? What kind of newspapers? What kind of magazines? Where are you getting your information? Thank you.
The first thing I have to read every day is the flood of emails and Slack channel updates that come through CBS News. Okay, and that comes from our foreign correspondents. It comes from our Hill team. It comes from our White House correspondents. It comes from our bureaus all over the nation. And that's a lot of work. That's 400 to 500 emails a day. And I don't read all of them, but I have to skim and have a pretty level-headed sense of those. I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post on a daily basis. I read The Economist every week. I try to read the Financial Times at least 2 or 3 times a week. And I try to go back to the communities in which I lived: Amarillo, Las Vegas, Houston, my alma mater, the University of Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, maybe once a week to just try to touch base and see what the headlines and things look like there. I also read The Nation and National Review and other perspectives on the left, if you will, and the right. I read The Atlantic. I used to work at National Journal. The Atlantic was a partner publication there. It's a beautiful and great history. I have many good friends who work there. But that's a lot. I also read, believe it or not, the Smithsonian, because I love the very nice historical breaks of things that are less heavy, just as a diversion. And I mentioned I have my 5th book in the works. So for that project, I have been reading a great number of books in the last 6 months, all of it related to elections, the status of our democracy and the fate thereof. So I've been immersed in that world as well.
Thanks so much.
Okay, I believe Wade had his hand raised as well.
Yes, ma'am. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
How you doing? Hi, Russell. Hi, Major. How you doing?
Good.
I love your presentation, sir, by the way. And yes, like you said, at first when I was in high school, I really did think you were a U.S. Army major at first. and oh yeah, I did, because my dad's a retired E7 Army, and he thought you were a commissioned officer. I heard major, but that's pretty cool, Major. I like that. but yeah, Major. My question is, sir, and I love how you said about being old school and old school journalism. I remember during the Gulf War when my dad stationed us at Fort Meade, Maryland. I remember when Wolf Blitzer and the other guys reported when we invaded Baghdad and stuff, and that I could never stop watching the news when the Scuds were in the air and stuff, and that was really cool. And I love how you said about you're sticking to your guns and your roots of journalism, and you're not changing, even though technology around you is changing, but you're still staying your ground as far as, the truth, and the truth is important. And as for me, Major, my question is, sir, I used to be a public affairs photographer in the Air National Guard, and in my civilian life, I used to be a cinematographer. Is in journalism and in the news world, as a cinematographer, would that be a problem in journalism? Do they look at like public affairs, like military public affairs guys, a different way than actual journalists? Or how should a public affairs prior serviceman, how would they adapt to the news
That's a
world?
really good question, and I'm glad you asked it. And I think 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been a bigger barrier than it is now, for a couple of reasons. One, there was this idea that anyone who had ever touched the world of public affairs, could no longer be trusted because they were co-opted by whomever they worked for. I think the greater understanding in newsrooms now is that people who operate in the world of information flow and can see it from another point of view, can see it from how the government or how any organization you work for saw and interacted with the news media, is actually a plus. I think newsrooms are much less likely to sort of regard that as, oh, you're tainted or you're somehow damaged goods. I don't think that's true anymore. And in terms of your photography experience, I think the cinematography is also an asset, because you know what a great deal about composition and about pictures that help tell a story that reinforce whatever the journalism is beneath it. And as long as you emphasize those points and take on in a very direct way whatever you think is important about your experience and meaningful in a news context, you'll get a lot less resistance than I think you would have 10 or 15 years ago.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, like you said, the technology is changing every day with cell phones and this and that. And there's so many uh, you know, it's almost like with cameras and it's like everybody's trying to make a movie because of technology now. And now you see less photographers and more cell phones, and now cell phones can do everything now.
Right.
And like it's like you said, journalism is starting to go that route where um people are not passionate about a real good story no more. And it's I noticed it's actually getting harder as far as uh, finding the truth. I've always want to be a war journalist or a war photographer, stuff like that. I mean, like I would love to go to Ukraine and report, the incident there and stuff like that. But
Wait,
it's
these
like,
are great questions, but I want to make sure we save enough room for James
oh, I'm
and
sorry.
Amine to get their questions in as well. Thank you so much, Wade.
Yes, sir.
Great,
Oh, yeah,
great,
thank you,
great
Major.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Major.
Okay, Amin, you can go ahead.
Thank you. These are great. Thank you, MVJ, and thank you, Philip, for doing this. Major, I've been watching you forever, and nobody can replace Walter Cronkite, but you definitely have the gravitas for that,
Oh,
and I aspire to that. So
Thank you.
which is amazing that you. I hear you, and like very, very as bad as this sound was actually a compliment. Very believable.
Thank
when
you.
I hear you. So I have a couple of questions. So I'm just going to shoot them right, and you take whichever one you want. So the first one, what have you learned from your podcasting that can be applied to journalism? Two, I'm launching an organization, a newspaper, an organization. Can I start with content before I get to journalism? And what's the right way to go to that? And I'm just thinking about the Skim. If you heard of this newsletter that started with, well, not first with just summarizing news article, the Skim, and then BuzzFeed, which kind of did as well. And the third thing, which is like kind of personal to me, I was an American interpreter in Iraq. And I'm always trying to kind of get that to the news. And I'm almost stumped most of the time, like who do I contact and how do I get this story? If Americans were on the front lines, how do I get that story out? So whichever one of this that you have the time you'd like to pick up, or all three, whichever. Anyway, I'm very grateful. Thank you, guys.
Sure. And go back to your first question.
What have you learned from podcasting that can be applied?
Oh, right.
Thank you so much.
So I created my podcast, The Takeout, right after the 2016 election for one very big reason. I saw that the trend lines of polarization were speeding up and becoming more pronounced. And I wanted to create a kind of a subversive place where the audience would be forced to listen to right and left week in and week out. And I told the audience that up front. One week you might hear someone you really love on the right, for example. And the next week you're going to have to hear someone you can't stand on the left, or vice versa. And I said, what you're going to experience is a full conversation with whomever the guest is that's unedited. One of the promises I make to my audience is that our guests are never edited. Whatever they say is what we air. And if they stumble or mispronounce something, you get to hear that. We don't clean anything up, and we don't give, through editing, an answer to another question. We don't jumble anything. It's all one conversation, and it runs 45 minutes. And my podcast had more senior White House and cabinet officials in the Trump administration than any show in America that wasn't on Fox. But it also had all the top progressives in Congress, Senate and House, and everything in between. I say it's policy, politics, and a little bit of pop culture. And we had no idea what the appetite for that show would be. We're on 75 radio stations, 15 of the top 25 markets. We're on Sirius XM, POTUS Channel 124. We're on every podcast platform, and we're on CBS News streaming. We get roughly, conservatively, 2 million impressions a month. For a show that has no staff, everyone who works on my show is a volunteer. It's not anyone's job. It's nominally my job. I basically created it as a side hustle. But I try to create this space where people could listen to politics in a way that is long form, unedited, and right and left, to kind of break through this thing I was talking about earlier, this siloification of American political conversation. Is it the most popular podcast in the news category? Not remotely. Do I know it would be more popular if it were more predictable? Absolutely. 100%. But I refuse to do that. I make my audience crane its neck in uncomfortable ways, right and left, because I think that's what the country needs. And that's what I've learned, that you can find at least some space commercially for this to exist. So this other idea about content and journalism and how to find your way in the digital space, there are far better people to ask that question to. But in general, because I know it's easier to put flashier content before you have substantive hardcore journalism, you're probably going to have to lead with content more than journalism, but don't forget the second and obsess over the former.
Okay, we'll do James really quick, and then Raymond, it looks like you also had a question, is that right? Okay, so we'll go ahead and do it in that order. Go ahead.
All right, thank you for having me. I don't think I'm as accomplished or in the avenue of most of you guys. I saw this because I work with Black deported veterans. I work with deported veterans specifically, but currently my focus is on Black deported veterans, because as I was working on a documentary, I came to find out that they were a underserved category while this was going on, and contacted more than 20 in over 11 countries. I've been trying my damnedest to get media to this, but what I've learned is they're kind of burnt out by what they've already seen in the my Latino brothers that have been coming back, or the stories that've been done on them. It was actually so bad that a journalist organization where I live at, I got an opportunity to go to one of their meetings, and they were more concerned with makeup and how they were supposed to appear as new MMJs to get ready for the NAHJ and NABJ conferences coming up. And the president of that organization just said to me, "So what, you're looking for some reporter to do a story on this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, bro. I mean, come on. It's like right off the bat, Black deported veteran. I mean, what isn't ringing right there?" So I listening to you, I began to understand more about the whole content situation. So my question actually is, how best can I get the attention to get people to cover this story?
So the simple answer, and this is not a guarantee, it's just an answer. The most important place to start is with a story that has resonance in a community. These deported veterans live somewhere in America. They had a town that either they called their hometown or was their town of most recent residence, and they have some connection there. And they're no longer there, if I understand what you're talking about. So they were in one place and now they're in another. And I imagine that there is a component, large or small or medium, of injustice in that you want to expose or bring light to. And most stories that work locally before they work at a state level or they work nationally. They have to gain traction somewhere. So local newsrooms, and this is harder because there are fewer newspapers through which to do this, but local TV stations. And it's harder in radio because radio stations aren't as vibrant and well-staffed as they used to be. Some major markets they are, but most markets they aren't. So really you're talking about the local TV station and trying to find a way to explain where they were, where they are, and what was the injustice or the misunderstanding or something really awful that needs to be explained as to how they got to where they are. They're an African-American veteran and they've been deported. Why? Where are they now? What is their circumstance and what led to this? And try to cement that in the mind and the editorial curiosity of a local newsroom.
Well, and I get that here. I'm in San Diego, by the way.
My hometown.
Yes. And they actually have covered a lot of the crossings that have happened and the stories. But an example of kind of like it seemed like a blind's eye was there was a media event that happened in February during Black History Month, where they, even in the promos, promoted that they were going to be recognizing the Black deported veteran. I and a guy from Kenya spoke for 10 minutes. In two stories that we looked at, we were never mentioned whatsoever in the story. It was the regurgitation of the same stories that had been going on past that. So I get what you're saying about the local thing, but it's like this was a local situation where people who actually have been covering it.
Right. So don't despair, follow up.
Okay.
Don't despair, follow up. Because there are human beings on the other side of that. They made decisions, ask them why. Be polite, be curious, but be persistent. Don't give up.
Okay, we are gonna go ahead and move on to Raymond, and then
I want to make sure, Devin, that we're being respectful of Major's time as well. Were we
yes,
supposed to end it? Were we supposed to end
I'm
it?
good. I'm good. I'll take one. No, one more is fine. No problem. No problem.
are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Raymond, you can go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Major. And
Hi.
like a good Washington correspondent, I'm going to ask this one of the same questions that's been asked in a different way.
Good.
To bounce off, and one more question, right? One last question.
Yeah, right.
To bounce off of what Wade was talking about, I'm really encouraged by the fact that the journalism industry doesn't see the public affairs thing as the stink anymore. All right. That said, what parts of our resume, what parts of our experience, public affairs experience, military experience, should we be hitting very hard in our cover letters and our resumes? What should we bring to the top? What should be in the 5 W's and H?
Right. So, and having never served, I only have conversations about military service through my friends and family, but I have a general sense that it requires, it inculcates discipline, focus, pursuit of mission, accomplishment of goals. All those things are fundamental in journalism, all of them. And at tempo. Journalism is a tempo business. If you can't hack tempo, you won't survive. And if you can't keep your focus under pressure, you won't cut it. All of those things, to a certain degree, are part of basic training, and many of the applications that you carry out in a military career in lots of different ways emphasize all of that. Now, one of the things that I think you should also discover within yourself and find a way to express is that you are not negatively regimented. And what I mean by that is there is a stereotype of military service that you'll only do what you're told to do and you won't think creatively or outside the box. That's not true. I'm not saying it's true, but I'm saying it can be a companion stereotype to someone who comes from the military. Oh, well, they just know how to take orders and they can't think out of the box. Well, ask any infantryman, they'll tell you, or infantrywoman, that's never the case. Or anyone who flies or operates on a flight deck. You have to improvise and make quick decisions to save people's lives and to carry out the mission. But there's that assumption. So think creatively about ways to express what your level of curiosity is, what your level of adaptation is, and why you want to do this kind of work. Journalism isn't a sexy business. Yes, some of us can appear on television and there is a certain D-list celebrity status that comes with that. But for the most of it, there isn't. It's not, it's grunt work, it's hard work. Also something familiar to someone who has a military career. Not everyone gets to be the star of the unit or the squad or the platoon. Working together collaboratively. Journalism, especially in the television world, is essential that you work collaboratively and you work productively, again, at tempo and with a sense of mission. All of those things are really, really important and lead you to be, I think, potentially successful in this world if you want to do it and you can explain why you want to do it. Why do you want to be this person in this place? That's kind of a baseline question in any organization you're trying to enter into. But journalism is a different kind of work, and why you want to do it and what it feeds you or how it feeds you to do it is an important part of the conversation. For me, it's always fed me. I've never gone to work a day in my life. That's a great thing to be able to say about a career, that you've never gone to work. I've gone to my job, sure, but I've never gone to work because I love it so much. And that's a great space to be in. I've been not only lucky enough to do it, but blessed enough to do this work and live out every dream I ever had.
So is it too
doing
hokey?
This work?
Is it too hokey to say, based on what you just said, to say that we're interested in continuing our careers in public service by working in journalism?
No.
It's not too
Now,
hokey.
look. As you pretty much have gathered by now, I'm on the cornier side and the old school side of the spectrum. Okay.
As am I. Yep.
So, it wouldn't bother me. Now, I can't give you universal, but I think that's an important way of contextualizing it. And I think it's and especially if it's meaningful to you, express it that way. And if I may indulge all of you, I've never served in the military, but I believe I've served my country.
Okay, thank you so much to Major Garrett and Phil Briggs for being here with us today. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have, so we are going to have to call it. Thank you so much to our members for attending as well.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's been a pleasure.
thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Be well.